Charles Darwin was born on the 12th of February 1809 in Shrewsbury, the county town of Shropshire in the west of England. His father was Robert Waring Darwin, a physician, who was remembered in part for his towering stature and imposing frame, at over 6 feet in height and weighing 24 stone. Darwin later recalled that his father was the largest man he had ever seen and noted the conversations that he would have with his father, who assumed that his son would follow him into the medical profession. Charles Darwin's mother was Susanna Darwin, née Wedgwood, who died suddenly when Charles was aged 8, of either a severe ulcer or stomach cancer. He later recalled that he could remember hardly anything about her except her deathbed, her black velvet gown, and her curiously constructed work table. Charles's grandfather on his father's side was Erasmus Darwin, a noted scientist who had proposed a theory of evolution in his poem, The Loves of the Plants, written in 1789. In it, he referenced vestigial organs in plants, flies, and humans, noting, for instance, the fact that human males had nipples, and flies had unused fourth wings. He also created designs for a rocket engine driven by hydrogen and oxygen, a canal bridge that would lift barges, and a copying machine, many of which were not realized in practice until long after his death. Erasmus Darwin was a notable writer and an accomplished man of science, who turned down an offer from George III to become his royal physician, and instead directed his attention to the writing of poetry and the management of a new club, the Lunar Society of Birmingham, which was devoted to philosophical discussion between industrialists, scientists, and poets, to name a few. The relationship between Erasmus and his son, Robert, was strained, leading Charles to have little contact with his grandfather's theories and writings. These were not treasured by Robert, who instead attempted to encourage the young Charles to become a man of medicine. The Darwin family also included several other children, including one younger and 3 older sisters, along with a single brother, Erasmus, who was 5 years older than Charles. His sister, Caroline, provided Charles with his first education, despite being only 9 years older than him. Having been educated for a time by Caroline, Charles later became a student of the Reverend G. Case, a Unitarian minister, who noted that Charles had a passion for collecting various ephemera from the natural world, including seashells, minerals, and stones. When aged 9, Charles was enrolled at Dr. Butler's school in Shrewsbury, where he boarded, despite only living a mile away. He recalled later that he would often run home before the school was closed for the night in order to see his family, which he argued was absolutely essential in maintaining his mental health and well-being. Darwin spent much of his free time reading, and was deeply engaged with the poetic works of Byron and the texts of Shakespeare, although he subsequently lost interest in them. He was also intrigued by the notion of travel, and took pleasure in reading works that illustrated adventure and distant lands. Charles's enthusiasm for science originated both from his readings and from the activities of his family members. His brother's fascination with chemistry prompted him to build a makeshift laboratory in their garden shed, and his uncle eagerly taught Charles about the functioning of a barometer. His interest in fauna was heightened during family trips, like those the Darwins took to the Welsh coast, where Charles observed that the insects and flowers found there varied from those native to his home county. Charles achieved average success in school and enrolled at the University of Edinburgh when he was 16, although his father noted that a major reason for his early departure from school was due to his lack of significant progress in his studies. Charles appeared emotionally stable, from what can be understood from contemporary accounts and autobiographical reflections, although he remembered that he had once kicked his puppy to experience the sense of power it gave him, and that he sometimes felt frustrated by the social status of the sciences, which were frequently viewed as below a gentleman's dignity. His father encouraged Charles to attend the University of Edinburgh, with the belief that this would lead to an inevitable medical career. The university was a prestigious hub for medical education, and counted among its graduates Charles Bell, the discoverer of Bell's palsy, as well as the functions of spinal nerves, William Hewson, the father of hematology, and James Lind, who identified cures for scurvy and typhus, along with creating the model for the first clinical trial. Charles started at the university with some doubts about his own enthusiasm for the field, and he was not aided by the subpar teaching he encountered there. Nonetheless, the university provided Charles with some experience he would eventually lean upon. He presented his first academic paper to the Plinian Society while studying there, and met an academic who would later support his theory of evolution, Dr. Grant. After 2 years at Edinburgh, Charles decided that he no longer wanted to pursue medicine. Indeed, this was already the decided conclusion following in the footsteps of his brother, who had previously left his medical studies at Edinburgh, and his father then resolved that he should pursue a career in the clergy as an alternative. Such was the case that Charles was admitted to Christ's College at the University of Cambridge at the age of 19. The university had proven to be immensely beneficial to Charles by introducing him to academics who would become significant and influential in his scientific journey. J.S. Henslow and Adam Sedgwick both had an impact on Charles during his time as a student and later in his life. Henslow was the individual who would coordinate Charles's expedition on the Beagle, frequently meeting with him for walks and conversations about science and art. Several others would also become his friends, including H. Thompson, who would later be an MP, and Dr. William Whewell, who was to be appointed as the Master of Trinity College and subsequently the Dean of Hereford. Darwin departed from Christ's College in 1831 and accompanied Sedgwick on a trip to North Wales the same year, where he learned about the theory and practice of geology and was given a chance to implement his newly acquired skills as part of an academic inquiry. In August 1831, Henslow reached out to Darwin and informed him of an expedition scheduled aboard the Beagle, a Cherokee-class 10-gun brig sloop of the Royal Navy. Its captain, Robert Fitzroy, had contacted Henslow, indicating that he would be glad to have a naturalist on his voyage, even though the naturalist would be traveling without remuneration. Darwin was thrilled at the opportunity to serve as a naturalist on a Royal Naval vessel, although his father was upset that he was once again moving away from a career as a physician or clergyman. Charles urged his uncle to discuss this matter with his father, and after a conversation between Josiah Wedgwood and his brother-in-law, Robert consented to allow Charles to join the Beagle. On December 27, 1831, the HMS Beagle set sail from Devonport. Charles, holding a degree in theology and classics, was the onboard naturalist. In a scientific capacity, he was isolated and had no peers with similar experience or knowledge, despite lacking a formal academic background in the field that was foundational to his vocation. Charles utilized his first day on the Beagle to create a personal timetable, which would enable him to delve deeper into the fields of meteorology, mathematics, and biology, as well as other subjects like French and the Greek New Testament, which he designated as part of his Sunday reading. He also possessed copies of Paradise Lost and Humboldt's Personal Narrative, where the scientist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt recounted his journeys to the Americas. Darwin mentioned in his correspondence home that he had a strained relationship with Captain Fitzroy, similar to many other crew members. Fitzroy hailed from the aristocracy and was an illegitimate descendant of Charles II, marked by a volatile temper, which could flare unpredictably and remain fixed for extended periods. Darwin also recounted an incident where he clashed with Fitzroy over the topic of slavery, which Fitzroy endorsed. Darwin noted that the debate became so heated that he contemplated leaving the Beagle entirely. Darwin shared his quarters aboard the Beagle with Augustus Earle, a draftsman, and developed friendships with a number of other crew members, including John Stokes and Charles Musters, a first-class volunteer. Another, Sims Covington, was a cabin boy who would later become a personal assistant to Darwin. Throughout the voyage, Darwin's notes illustrate a man growing increasingly convinced of the influence of natural selection, along with his belief that fossils were the remnants of organisms that had existed prior to the arrival of humans, all of which he formulated during his initial weeks at sea, as he studied aboard the ship in his cabin. He simultaneously fought seasickness and stated simply that the Bay of Biscay was hell. In the early weeks of 1832, Darwin initiated practical studies and created a net for gathering plankton, which he examined and wrote about passionately in his journals, remarking on the wide variety of colors and shapes that these organisms exhibited. On January 16th, the Beagle reached land on St. Jago, a part of the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of present-day Mauritania. He remembered that when he first set foot on the island, he was captivated by the volcanic rocks, the songs of unfamiliar birds, and the extensive variety of flora and fauna that captured his attention. During his stay in the Cape Verde Islands, Darwin formulated a theory that hard white rocks, which scattered the islands, were once molten lava flows that had traveled across the seabed and held impressions from shells and coral reefs. On February 28th, the crew of the Beagle stepped onto the shores of Bahia, now a state in Brazil, and the location of the city of Salvador. He noted that this land is a chaos of delight, and his experiences in Brazil were to significantly influence him and his work. He described the beauty of wildlife and nature in Brazil, and asserted that this represented nature in its grandest form. He also mentioned that, to a naturalist, there was a pleasant nuisance in needing to pause every few yards to examine a new creature or flower. Darwin also witnessed significant slavery in Brazil, which was the last nation in the Western world to abolish the practice, which it finally did in 1888. He was profoundly troubled by what he observed and wrote that, "I hope the day will come when they will assert their own rights and forget to avenge their wrongs." Darwin and his companions settled in the small village of Botafogo, situated a short distance from Rio de Janeiro, positioned on a lagoon. He soon embarked on a 3-week journey into the countryside from his base, during which he traveled a distance of several hundred miles, in what would have been a striking and exhausting introduction to his new environment. When operating from his base in Botafogo, Darwin also adhered to a disciplined schedule, collecting specimens one day, followed by a day dedicated to preserving and analyzing his discoveries, a 2-day schedule that he sustained throughout his stay. Darwin had the opportunity to witness dramatic and thrilling natural occurrences firsthand when in Brazil, and noted with keen interest an event where he saw a vampire bat attack a horse. He documented his observations on glowworms, butterflies, and fungi. On July 5, 1832, the Beagle departed Rio and headed south toward Montevideo, which is now the capital of Uruguay. Upon their arrival, the crew learned that a revolution was occurring in the city, an occurrence that was part of a series of conflicts that had arisen in Uruguay after the Declaration of Independence in 1828, and illustrated a struggle between two political factions that filled the void left behind. Fitzroy opted not to dock in Montevideo and instead continued on to Buenos Aires, where they were shot at by an Argentine naval ship, a situation that was later resolved by the governor. Following this, the Beagle returned to Montevideo, and Fitzroy asked to dock at a private mooring. After this stop, the Beagle proceeded south, tracing the coastline to study it. It was during this leg of the journey that Darwin was stranded for one night due to adverse weather, which prevented the Beagle from coming to retrieve him from the island where he had paused to gather samples. He would later recount that he had never experienced such cold, although the ordeal led him to discover samples of intriguing fossils, including that of the extinct giant armadillo and the giant sloth. The vessel continued to ferry back and forth between Buenos Aires and Montevideo, enabling the crew to send and receive mail, and Darwin to dispatch his specimens home. Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, also engaged in a troubling practice when he released 3 Fuegian prisoners he had attempted to westernize during a previous voyage, returning them to their communities with an odd collection of items, including cabbages, tea trays, cutlery, and wine glasses. However, this was an event that Darwin expressed his disapproval of. The subsequent weeks were spent by Darwin conducting writing expeditions throughout Buenos Aires and Patagonia, during which he claimed to have experienced the extremes of human comfort. He noted that he often endured intense thirst and that the seemingly endless riding had left him feeling extremely fatigued. He was also bothered by mosquitoes, and noted that the jaguars inhabiting the nearby forests instilled great fear in his guides. Upon returning from an expedition to Buenos Aires, Darwin discovered he was unable to enter the city due to yet another revolution, and instead was compelled to stay outside the city limits for an extensive duration. He could not get to the Beagle until the 4th of November. The Beagle sustained damage during her journey and needed repairs, which were carried out at the river's mouth. In the meantime, Fitzroy arranged an expedition to the Cordillera de la Costa mountain range, which would necessitate the crew to embark on a 245-mile journey upstream, a voyage that took 13 days to complete, and which the captain ultimately considered a failure. On the 12th of May, 1834, the Beagle departed on her final voyage south and entered the Pacific Ocean on the 9th of June, eventually arriving in Valparaiso, Chile, at the close of July. From this point, Darwin trekked the Andes and was able to notice the variations in flora and fauna that correlated with their elevation. Darwin then fell ill, likely suffering from Chagas's disease, which made him experience fever, swollen lymph nodes, and headaches, and which some historians have attributed to his later poor health, such as his fatigue and heart issues. He noted in his correspondence home that he had undergone significant periods of exhaustion and that he had experienced blackouts and confusion. From Valparaiso, Darwin undertook one of his most significant geological expeditions, ascending 10,000 feet into the Andes to study the segmentation of the Earth from the slopes of the mountains that surrounded him. He remarked that, "It was the first view I ever saw which really resembled those attractive sections that geologists create of the interior of the Earth." Darwin also progressed on one of his longest journeys, traveling approximately 450 miles to the north, during which he gathered well over 100 geological specimens, which he classified and documented. By this point, he had been away from home for more than 3.5 years, and his letters, despite demonstrating his enthusiasm for his work, reflected a strong desire to return to England. On the 7th of September, 1835, the Beagle departed for the Galapagos Islands, which would become synonymous with Darwin's research. As soon as the vessel anchored near the islands, the emphasis of Darwin's work shifted from geology to biology, and he eagerly noted that the flora and fauna of the islands closely mirrored those of South America. Darwin's study of tortoises and birds on the islands was driven by his interest in the fact that locals could identify the island from which an animal originated based on its appearance. Such was the localization of their variants. He realized that finches on the different islands had distinctions in their appearance that correlated with the island from which they had come. The beaks of the Galapagos finches caught Darwin's attention, and he observed that some were more suited for eating insects, while others were for seeds. This indicated a biological niche that suggested they were a type of adaptation influenced by specific environments. Nevertheless, his notes from that period imply that he did not comprehend the implications of his observation, noting that, "When I see these islands in sight of each other and possessed of but a limited stock of animals, occupied by these birds but slightly different in structure and serving the same role in nature, I must suspect that they are merely varieties." The Beagle spent an additional 4 weeks in the Galapagos archipelago before sailing south across the Pacific, spending Christmas Day of 1835 in New Zealand. While there, he praised the efforts undertaken by missionaries in the area. Indeed, one of his first published accounts from the voyage was featured in an edition of the South African Christian Recorder, where he wrote, "Missionaries truly merit the strongest support, not only from individuals, but from the British government." So strong was his interest in the endeavors of these organizations that Darwin co-signed this statement with Captain Fitzroy of the Beagle. On January 12, 1836, the Beagle arrived in Australia, marking the 5th year of her expedition. He penned in his journal that he was gratified to have some immunity to European diseases, given the suffering of native populations caused by illnesses like measles. In Australia, Darwin also remarked on the resemblances among various mammal species, and observed that their evolution had occurred simultaneously with those on different continents. He noted in his writings that he was astonished that such similarities had arisen through such diverse pathways, commenting that it appeared as if two creators had produced the same outcome through wholly dissimilar processes. The Beagle then set course for home, making an unplanned stop in Bahia, where the ship had arrived 4.5 years earlier. Darwin was weary and longed for a return to England, stating, "We have now navigated, thanks to God, a direct route back to England." During the return journey, Darwin contemplated the grandeur of the unspoiled natural world that he had experienced throughout his expedition and the might of nature, which he had witnessed undefaced. He considered this to be nearly a spiritual experience, expressing that it instilled a feeling that there is more to man than just the physical expanse of his body. On October 2, 1836, the Beagle reached Falmouth in Cornwall, and 2 days later, Darwin returned to his residence in Shrewsbury for the first time in over 5 years. He discovered that his family welcomed him back with warmth, and his father, impressed by his findings, accepted his decision to pursue a career in naturalism. Once he arrived home, Darwin went to Cambridge and then to London to organize and edit the official zoology of the Voyage of the Beagle, in which he wrote in detail about the journey as well as his findings and thoughts. Humboldt, his idol, was impressed with Darwin's work and complimented his writing on travels in the tropics. Over the span of the 1840s, Darwin released additional works that originated from research he had performed on the Beagle, including coral reefs, volcanic islands, and geological observations on South America, during which he was able to meet various esteemed scientists, such as Sir Charles Lyell and Sir Joseph Hooker. Lyell was a leading scientist and advocate of the theory of uniformitarianism, in which he argued the concept that contemporary natural laws and processes exist not merely today, but across space and time, having played a role in shaping the current effects in geology. Darwin embraced this theory and asserted further that it was a dynamic process that had a continual impact in the present and could serve to explain a persistent process of reform and change in organisms. Hooker was a young man who shared a deep passion for naturalism with Darwin. The two became close friends, and it was to Hooker that Darwin confided his theory of natural selection, which remained a secret between them for several years. By the time he returned from his voyage, Darwin was convinced that organisms underwent a process of change and adaptation. He further theorized that this could occur on a grand scale, and that the changes that happened within a species could account for wholesale and significant alterations both in their appearance and their way of life. In July 1837, Darwin began work on a new text, which he titled The Transformation of Species, and, only just over a year later, he had documented what we now refer to as the theory of natural selection, which remains a fundamental foundation on which modern science stands. Darwin developed and documented the cognitive process that led to this theory through a thought process that is evident in his notebooks. He started from an observation that sexual reproduction leads to greater variation in a species than does asexual or parthenogenic reproduction, which could be highly diverse in its extent and nature. Darwin observed that, through reproduction, offspring within a species exhibited differences from one another and from their parents, which can be classified as random variation. These differences did not seem to be directed toward any environmental advantage or design and were random, sometimes impeding the ability of the genotype organism to survive, and other times enhancing it. This method of random variation would, over time, become widespread among a population of offspring in which the variance it offered was advantageous for survival. Those of a species better adapted to a specific environment would thrive and transmit these traits to their own offspring, resulting in an entire population of a species within a certain region exhibiting these specific variations. This phenomenon is sometimes referred to as adaptive niches. This concludes the first part of the documentary. If you enjoyed it, stay tuned for the second part. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what topics you'd like to see next.